The Kintyre Uranium Project in Western Australia. So the Minister's given conditional approval to Cameco and Mitsubishi's uranium proposal at Kintyre. Are you familiar with that project?
Yes.
Okay, great. Are you undertaking any further work on that, or is your role concluded?
Senator, on the 22nd of April 2015, the Minister approved the Kintyre project with 39 conditions.
Yeah.
So our approval process effectively stops at that point. Yeah. However, under the conditions, for example, one of the key requirements is an environmental management plan, and that will be subject to post-approval consideration and approval prior to the project commencing.
All right, thank you. So conditions 29 to 32 of your approval set out requirements for the proponent to enter into a bond, securities or funds arrangement with the West Australian state government. So that's to provide for rehabilitation and mine closure. So that's all. I think that's all reasonably clear. But under West Australian law, there's actually no longer any explicit requirement for bonds or securities. They've changed the legal framework there quite substantially. So to me, it reads as though there's a conflict between the federal requirements for that kind of arrangement and state law. Can you just tell us how that's to be resolved with this project specifically in mind?
Senator, I understand the WA Mining Act. Under the WA Mining Act, all tenement holders, which would include Cameco Australia, are required to report disturbance data and contribute annually to a mining rehabilitation fund.
So you don't see there's any consistency between the conditions that your minister applied?
No, and
you advised?
I should add, we also, as part of that process, the minister would consult with various ministers that have administrative interests within the approval, and we did consult with the WA Minister for Mining and Petroleum, who indicated that the conditions were fine. Is there a requirement that whatever form the bond appears in covers 100% of the mine rehabilitation cost on a sort of progressive or rolling basis? So what the conditions do is set up the ability for the minister to require further financial assurance should there not be sufficient funding in there. Your minister or the state minister? The Commonwealth Minister is able to do that. He's able to, is he required to do that? He's not required to. The conditions firstly require Cameco Australia to review the cost of rehabilitation every 3 years. Okay. And on that basis, provide advice on whether there's sufficient funding in the mining rehabilitation fund, and then if needed, there is capacity through the conditions for the minister to seek a top-up. To intervene. Okay. Is there a requirement that it be 100% of the rehab cost on that sort of rolling 3-year basis, or is that discretionary? It would be a top-up to the shortfall between what's potentially available under the fund and what's required based on a assessment of rehabilitation. And that's mandatory? It's not. It doesn't sound discretionary the way you're describing it there. The condition requires that they do review the cost of rehabilitation every 3 years. I understand the review process. It sounds reasonably clear. Yep. Is it mandatory that there be enough funds? Well, that's subject to the minister's consideration at that time. Okay, so that part is sounding now quite discretionary. What if it's the minister's having the kind of day where he's fairly relaxed and doesn't feel like there needs to be 100% of the rehab costs in the bank?
Well, Senator, again, we're in hypotheticals.
No, we're actually not in hypothetical territory. This is happening in Kakadu right now, where you have a proponent saying they may not be able to clean up the mess they've created.
In relation to this project, we're in hypotheticals, and that would depend, as Dr. Banks has said, on the advice that's provided from the department, from the proponent in the first instance, from the department, and then the minister's decision at the time. But it would be open to the minister to, as I understand it, and Dr. Banks will correct me here if I'm wrong, if there was a top-up required for the minister to vary a condition related to the approval to secure that. Yeah. Okay. So the minister has that discretion to be able to, if he chose to make it more firm, then yes, the condition could be varied. So it does have that power.
All right, thank you. I don't think it's hypothetical to ask how your Act operates in the real world, because, correct me again if I am in error, because I don't want to walk out of here and say stuff that misrepresents the truth, that is in nobody's interests, that if the minister didn't feel like imposing 100% clean-up obligation on the company, then he or she doesn't have to do so. It sounds like the 3-yearly rolling advice would have the department in reasonable clarity as to whether there is enough to fully clean up the site. And we can argue about whether that's possible at a uranium site. That's probably a separate conversation. But the Minister is not obliged to ensure that 100% of the rehab funds is in the bank at any given time. He could choose to do so, but he doesn't have to, he or she.
And we've explained the condition as it stands now. And yes, there is a decision point for the Minister at that point, and there is a power for him to act in a particular way to secure that.
Senator Luckman, can I just get you to pause and I'll just share it around and I'll come back if we have some time, unless you only have one or two.
I've just basically got one further question on this and then I'll let you go. Thanks for your patience. So during the period of the Minister and the Department's deliberations of this project, you received, I understand, nearly 10,000 individual submissions, which were based along a sort of standard petition format, but also a fair number of dedicated correspondence from various organisations. I'm also aware that you received a copy of the appeal made to the WA EPA appeal convener by the Bangor Aboriginal community, which are in quite close proximity to the project area. That submission raised a number of quite important issues with regard to the state EPA assessment of the project that have direct relevance for your consideration. So was the Bangor appeal considered in your process, and how was their appeal I guess brought to bear in the conditions that you set?
Senator, the Bangor appeal was included in our assessment process. It was also considered carefully by the WA appeals convener, which is where that appeal was lodged. And on the basis of both the appeals convener findings, the WA government assessment report and other material, the Minister agreed with the appeals convener that considered that there had been adequate consultation through the process and that various matters had been dealt with appropriately.
Okay. So just finally then, there were no additional conditions or any material changes to your approvals as a result of bearing their submission in mind?
Their submission amongst a whole range of material was taken into consideration in terms of determining an appropriate level of conditioning for the project.
It's a very clever answer. All right, thanks all for your time. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Senator. Look, I've just got a couple of